The chalk hit the floor before anyone in that lecture hall could breathe. It had been placed there deliberately, set down with the kind of slow, theatrical precision that only someone very certain of their own superiority would bother to perform. Professor Aldrich Voss stood at the center of MIT's Kresge Auditorium, his blazer pressed to a razor edge, his posture communicating what his words had not yet needed to say, that the man mopping the corridor outside these doors was beneath his notice, beneath this institution, and beneath this room full of the country's most elite mathematical minds. On the whiteboard behind him, a long equation sprawled across the full length of the board, dense, intricate, layered with nested functions and partial derivatives. Voss had written it there on purpose. And now he had cracked the door open just wide enough, just long enough, for the janitor working the hallway to see it. He turned to his graduate students with a thin, practiced smile. "Let us see," he said quietly, "what the invisible people among us actually notice." What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share the story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to Lifeline Tales for more unforgettable stories. Boston had not always been this cold to Daniel Reyes. There was a time, not so many years ago, when he had walked through the corridors of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology not with a mop in hand, but with a lanyard bearing his name and a title that made graduate students straighten in their chairs when he entered a room. Dr. Daniel Reyes. Applied Mathematics. Computational Fluid Dynamics. The kind of researcher who received grant letters before he had finished his morning coffee. That was before Elena. His wife had been diagnosed 4 years into his tenure-track career, a quiet, relentless illness that arrived without warning and departed only when it had taken everything it wanted. Daniel had spent the last 18 months of her life stepping back from lectures, from conferences, from the world of whiteboards and fellowships, simply to be present, to sit beside her, to hold her hand through the long hospital nights while the radiators knocked and the machines breathed their mechanical rhythm. When she passed on a Tuesday in February, she left behind a daughter named Maya, 6 years old, who still asks some mornings when Mama was coming back. Daniel had no answer that did not break him, so instead he worked. The faculty positions had dried up in his absence. The academic world is unforgiving of gaps, however sacred the reason for them. He had tried, letters sent, phone calls made, doors politely closed. He had needed income immediately, not eventually. And so, he took the only position offered to him within walking distance of Maya's school, facilities maintenance at MIT's Cambridge campus, working the evening and early morning shifts, mopping floors and replacing bulbs in the very building where he had once delivered lectures that drew standing room audiences. He wore no name tag that told his history. He owned 2 sets of work clothes and 1 good sweater he saved for Maya's school performances. His hands, which had once moved across whiteboards with elegant confidence, were now weathered by cleaning solution and pushing heavy equipment across marble floors in the dark. He did not speak of his past. He had not been asked. The crisis arrived, as these things often do, with a phone call that no one was prepared for. MIT's Department of Applied Sciences had been contracted to consult on a catastrophic engineering failure at the Harwick Energy Consortium, a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project along the eastern seaboard whose computational modeling had collapsed in the final validation phase. The error had propagated silently through 6 months of simulation data, undetected, threatening to invalidate a $12 billion investment and expose the university's consulting arm to a liability that would have made the front page of every financial publication in the country. They had 4 hours. Professor Voss had assembled his finest minds, 3 senior faculty members, 2 visiting consultants from Stanford, and a cohort of doctoral candidates who had been pulled from their dissertations and deposited into the conference room adjacent to Kresge Auditorium. The whiteboard was covered within minutes. Laptops were opened. Voices raised and then fell and raised again. The Stanford consultants spoke with tremendous confidence for 40 minutes before arriving, quietly, at the same dead end the MIT team had reached. The error was structural. embedded deep within a boundary layer assumption that had seemed reasonable in isolation but cascaded catastrophically when integrated across the full model. Nobody in the room could locate it. Voss paced. He was not a man accustomed to pacing. The graduate students exchanged glances across the table, the kind that people exchange when they are realizing together that the authority in the room does not have the answer, and that admitting this may be more dangerous than continuing to pretend otherwise. Outside the conference room, Daniel Reyes moved his mop in slow, even arcs across the hallway tile. He had heard the raised voices before he reached the room. Then he had heard the terminology. And something in him, something that 4 years of grief and silence and quiet maintenance work had not managed to extinguish, had gone completely, involuntarily still. He stood with his mop handle resting against the wall and looked through the narrow window panel in the door at the whiteboard. His eyes moved across the equation. Once. Then again. His lips moved slightly, silently, the way a man reads something in a language he learned before he learned to walk. Daniel did not knock. He simply opened the door. The room turned as one, a dozen faces in various states of frustration, exhaustion, and condescension, all of them arriving at the same expression when they saw who had entered. A man in gray maintenance clothes, holding nothing, standing in the doorway of a room where the intellectual architecture of a billion-dollar project was in the process of failing. "I apologize for the interruption," Daniel said. His voice was quiet and unhurried, the voice of a man who has learned that composure is the only currency that cannot be taken from you. "But I believe I can see where the error originates." Professor Voss turned from the whiteboard. For a moment, pure reflex governed his expression, a visible narrowing, the slight lift of the chin that signals a correction already forming on the lips. One of the Stanford consultants actually laughed briefly before catching himself. "This is a restricted faculty session," Voss said. His tone was not unkind. It was something worse. It was dismissive in the way that only comes from deep, unexamined certainty about who belongs where. Daniel did not move from the doorway. "The boundary layer assumption in the third nested integral," he said. "You've treated it as continuous across the full domain, but the physical system it models undergoes a phase transition at approximately the 2/3 threshold. The assumption was valid for the initial conditions, but doesn't hold under integrated stress. The error propagates from there." The room was very quiet. One of the doctoral students had already turned to his laptop. His fingers were moving. Then they stopped. "He's right," the student said. "He said it the way you say something when you're not yet sure you should say it out loud. This is exactly where the divergence begins." Voss stared at Daniel for a long moment. The thin certainty in his posture had not left. It was simply encountering, for perhaps the first time in years, something it could not classify. "Who are you?" he asked. Daniel walked to the whiteboard. Someone moved aside without being asked. He picked up a marker and began to write, not hurriedly, not with performance, but with the calm fluency of a man returning to a room he has lived in his entire life. The work took 11 minutes. The correction was elegant, comprehensive. It restructured the boundary condition with a formulation that 3 of the faculty members in that room would later describe in their reports as, and this was the word each of them used, independently beautiful. When he set the marker down, the silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of awe. "My name is Daniel Reyes," he said simply. "I completed my doctorate here in 2011. Computational fluid dynamics. I have been working maintenance on this floor for the past 2 years." One of the doctoral students in the back row had quietly slipped out of the room during the final minutes of Daniel's work at the board. He had gone down the hallway to the small staff break room where, on certain mornings, he had seen the janitor sitting with a small girl who brought her homework. He found Maya there now, 8 years old, doing multiplication tables in a notebook, her backpack too large for her small frame. "I think," the student said carefully, "you should come see something." When Maya walked into that conference room and saw her father standing at the whiteboard, surrounded by professors who were now on their feet, some already beginning to applaud, the sustained and genuine applause that does not require direction, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at the board. She looked at her father. She looked at the faces of the people surrounding him, faces she had only ever seen look through him or past him. And then she began to cry, silently, the way children cry when something inside them that has been braced for a long time is finally allowed to rest. Professor Aldrich Voss was not a cruel man. He had simply, for a very long time, been an incurious one, incurious about the lives of the people who moved quietly through the margins of his world, maintaining the floors he walked and the lights that kept his office bright. Facing Daniel across that whiteboard, in the company of his colleagues and students, he felt the full weight of that incuriosity arrive in his chest like a stone. He crossed the room. He extended his hand. When Daniel took it, Voss held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not only for today." Daniel looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. And then, because he was the kind of man he was, he said, "Thank you for saying it." Within the week, Daniel Reyes was offered a formal research position within the department, a role that the dean described, in the letter that accompanied it, as long overdue. There were newspaper pieces. There were, inevitably, the conversations and reckonings that institutions have when they are forced to confront the distance between who they say they value and who they have actually seen. Daniel accepted the position with one condition, submitted in writing, 3 sentences long, that a portion of the consulting fee recovered from the Harwick project be directed toward competitive scholarships for MIT's facilities staff, the custodians, the maintenance workers, the people who moved through the margins, and toward childcare support for employees raising children alone. The condition was accepted without revision. Some years later, when Daniel's students asked him what the most important equation of his career had been, he would pause in the way that thoughtful people pause, not for effect, but because they are actually thinking. "It was not on any whiteboard," he would say. "It was the one my daughter taught me. Every morning she came to work with me and did her homework without complaint. That dignity plus patience equals something the world cannot ignore, no matter how hard it tries." And that is the truth this story carries, simple and unyielding. That greatness does not announce itself with titles or tailored blazers or the approval of rooms that believe themselves to be important. Greatness arrives quietly, in weathered hands and steady voices, in the people who keep showing up for the ones who need them, day after day, without recognition and without surrender. Every single person you pass in a corridor carries a history you have not read. Every invisible worker carries battles you have not been asked to fight. Before you decide what someone deserves, ask yourself what you actually know about what they have already survived.